The scorching sun cast long shadows across the dusty streets of El Paso as Sheriff Henry Anderson made his evening rounds, his boots leaving deep impressions in the sun-baked earth. The border town had grown restless lately, with increasing tensions between the local ranchers and mysterious newcomers who seemed to appear from nowhere, speaking of ancient prophecies and lost treasures. Henry wasn't one for tall tales, but something about these strangers set his instincts on edge. Margaret Clark, the town's schoolteacher, watched from her classroom window as the sheriff passed by. She had arrived in El Paso 3 months ago, carrying more secrets than books in her leather satchel. The children had just left for the day, leaving behind the lingering scent of chalk dust and the soft whisper of paper settling in the afternoon heat. She knew she couldn't keep her true identity hidden much longer, not with the soldiers drawing closer. The saloon owned by Frank Taylor served as the town's unofficial gathering place, where whispered conversations carried more weight than gold. Henry pushed through the swinging doors, noting the unusual tension in the air. Frank stood behind the bar, methodically polishing glasses while keeping a watchful eye on a group of soldiers seated in the corner. They weren't regular army. Their uniforms bore unfamiliar insignias, and their weapons seemed too ornate for standard military issue. Laura Moore, the mysterious woman who had taken refuge in the church's basement, trembled as she heard boots on the wooden floor above. Father Daniel had promised to protect her, but even he couldn't stand against the forces pursuing her. Her fingers traced the intricate tattoos that marked her as the last priestess of an ancient order, guardians of a secret that could reshape the territory or destroy it. The sound of breaking glass shattered the evening calm as two soldiers burst into the schoolhouse. Margaret's heart raced as she slipped the sacred scrolls deeper into her desk drawer. They weren't looking for her, not yet, but she knew they would eventually connect her to Laura. The two women shared a bond deeper than blood, both carrying pieces of a map that led to something far more valuable than gold. Henry noticed the commotion from across the street and quickened his pace. He'd grown suspicious of these soldiers ever since they'd arrived, claiming to be hunting deserters. Their real interests seemed focused on the church and schoolhouse, places that held no strategic value, unless they knew something he didn't. The sheriff's hand rested on his revolver, a weapon that had served him well through years of maintaining peace in this lawless stretch of border territory. Charlie Walker, the town's telegraph operator, had been monitoring an unusual increase in coded messages between military outposts. As Henry's closest friend and confidant, he'd shared his concerns about a pattern emerging, one that suggested these soldiers weren't acting on official orders. The messages mentioned something about a sacred guardian and a golden city, phrases that seemed more at home in dime novels than military correspondence. The situation escalated when Robert Anderson, Henry's younger brother and deputy, reported finding ancient artifacts in the hills outside town. The pieces were unlike anything they'd seen before. Gold-inscribed tablets covered in symbols matching the tattoos on Laura's arms. The discovery had drawn unwanted attention, and now the soldiers were becoming more aggressive in their search. As dusk settled over El Paso, Margaret made her way to the church using the growing shadows as cover. She carried a message for Laura, written in a script few living souls could read. The two women had been entrusted with protecting not just a map, but the key to an entire civilization's legacy. The soldiers' presence meant others had learned of their secret, and time was running out. Henry intercepted Margaret before she reached the church, pulling her into the shadow of an alley. "Those men aren't who they claim to be," he whispered, his voice grave. "They're part of something called the Order of the Crimson Dawn." Charlie intercepted a message. "They're hunting for something they call the Guardian's Map." Margaret's face paled. She had hoped to keep the sheriff out of this, but fate had other plans. The truth began to unravel like a frayed rope. Laura wasn't simply seeking sanctuary. She was the last of an ancient lineage of priestesses, protectors of a map leading to a city of unimaginable wealth and power. The tattoos on her skin were more than decoration. They were pieces of the map itself, designed to protect the secret from those who would abuse it. Margaret, as her appointed guardian, carried the key to decoding these living directions. Father Daniel's voice rang out in the gathering darkness, calling for help. The soldiers had grown tired of waiting and had forced their way into the church. Henry drew his revolver, knowing that whatever happened next would change not just his life, but the fate of the entire territory. The simple land disputes he'd spent years mediating suddenly seemed trivial compared to the conflict now unfolding in his town. Henry moved swiftly through the church's side door, his boots silent on the worn wooden floors. The flickering light of oil lamps cast dancing shadows across the pews as he heard the soldiers' heavy footfalls at the main entrance. Father Daniel stood resolute at the altar, his weathered hands gripping the lectern as four uniformed men pushed their way inside, their brass buttons gleaming in the dim light. The sheriff's mind raced through his options, knowing that any wrong move could spell disaster. These weren't ordinary soldiers. Their non-regulation gear and missing insignias marked them as mercenaries, likely hired by whoever was hunting Laura. The way they carried themselves, with that peculiar mix of military precision and lawless swagger, reminded him of the raiders he'd encountered during his time patrolling the Cheyenne border. Margaret pressed herself against the confessional's dark wood, one hand protectively covering Laura's mouth to muffle her breathing. The young priestess's tattoos seemed to shimmer in the darkness, the intricate patterns forming fragments of a map that had cost countless lives over the centuries. Henry could see fear in Margaret's eyes, but there was something else too, a fierce determination that spoke of years spent protecting her sacred charge. "This is a house of God," Father Daniel's voice carried through the chapel, steady despite the tension. "You have no authority here." The lead soldier, a scarred man with cold eyes, merely smiled and produced a document bearing the territorial governor's seal. Henry recognized it as a forgery. He'd seen enough official papers to spot the subtle inconsistencies in the ink and letterhead. The situation deteriorated quickly as two more men appeared at the church's rear entrance, their spurs jingling ominously on the floorboards. Henry caught a glimpse of Frank, his deputy, positioning himself behind the bell tower's exterior wall, ready to provide covering fire if needed. They'd worked together long enough to read each other's intentions without words. Laura's fingers traced the air in strange patterns, and Henry noticed the shadows in the church beginning to shift unnaturally. Margaret had mentioned something about the priestess's ancient powers, but seeing it firsthand sent a chill down his spine. The soldiers noticed it too, their confident postures faltering as darkness seemed to gather and coalesce around them. Outside, the wind picked up suddenly, carrying with it the scent of sage and desert rain. The townsfolk of Dodge City, drawn by the commotion at the church, began gathering in small clusters along the street. Henry could see Susan, the saloon owner, ushering curious onlookers away from potential danger, while Rachel, the schoolteacher, quietly guided her remaining students toward the safety of the general store. The lead soldier's patience wore thin. "We know she's here," he snarled, gesturing for his men to begin searching the pews. "The map belongs to our employer. Hand over the girl, and no one needs to die tonight." Henry's hand tightened on his revolver, knowing that these men had no intention of leaving witnesses regardless of cooperation. Margaret's voice came as a whisper, barely audible above the growing wind. "The passage beneath the vestry. We can reach the old mission trail." Henry nodded imperceptibly, remembering the network of tunnels the early settlers had built beneath the town. If they could just buy enough time to reach them, they might have a chance of escaping toward El Paso. The air grew thick with tension as Henry stepped from his hiding place, badge gleaming in the lamplight. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying the weight of authority that had served him well through countless confrontations. "I suggest you take a careful look around. This isn't just a church you're desecrating. It's my town." As if to emphasize his point, the distinct sound of rifles being cocked echoed from the bell tower, where Frank had positioned their most trusted deputies. The soldiers exchanged glances, their confidence wavering as they realized they'd lost the element of surprise. The leader, a weathered man with a distinctive cavalry scar across his cheek, kept his rifle trained on Henry while gesturing to his men to spread out across the chapel. The moonlight filtering through the stained glass windows cast ethereal patterns across their faces, making them appear more like specters than men. "Your reputation precedes you, Sheriff," the scarred man drawled. "But even you must understand that some things are bigger than local law. That map the Priestess carries could change the entire territory. Stand aside, and we can all walk away from this." His words carried a hollow promise that Henry had heard too many times before from desperate men. Margaret's fingers brushed against Henry's arm, and he could feel her trembling despite her outward composure. The ancient parchment hidden beneath her robes seemed to pulse with its own energy, a burden passed down through generations of her order. The scorching desert wind whipped around Sheriff Henry Anderson as he crouched behind a weathered boulder, his keen eyes fixed on the military encampment below. The makeshift garrison sat in a narrow valley just outside El Paso, where Lieutenant Frank Moore had imprisoned Rachel Clark, the last surviving priestess of an ancient indigenous order. Henry had tracked them for 3 days, following rumors of a secret map that could lead to riches beyond imagination. Through his brass spyglass, Henry observed the camp's routines, noting the guards' positions and timing. Rachel's tent stood apart from the others, marked by distinctive ceremonial symbols painted on its canvas walls. Lieutenant Moore's obsession with finding the lost city of gold had driven him to kidnap the priestess, believing she held the key to its location. Henry knew the military had no jurisdiction here in this lawless border territory. The situation grew more complex when Henry spotted Daniel Walker, a local landowner, conferring with Moore near the command tent. Walker had been stirring up trouble, claiming ancient land rights that extended deep into disputed territory. His presence suggested a broader conspiracy, one that threatened not just Rachel, but the delicate peace in these borderlands. As dusk approached, Henry made his way carefully down the rocky slope, using the lengthening shadows for cover. He'd left his deputy, Charlie Taylor, back in El Paso with instructions to bring reinforcements if he didn't return by morning. The weight of his Winchester rifle provided little comfort against the 30 soldiers stationed below, but Henry had a plan that relied more on cunning than firepower. Rachel's guard rotation changed at sunset, creating a brief window of opportunity. Henry had noticed how the replacement soldier always arrived exactly 3 minutes before the previous guard departed, a small gap in their otherwise precise military discipline. He'd also observed Rachel's habit of singing ancient prayers at twilight, her haunting melody carrying across the camp like a spirit's whisper. Using Rachel's songs as cover, Henry worked his way closer to the perimeter. The evening ritual had become so familiar to the soldiers that they paid it little mind, but tonight it would serve a different purpose. He'd arranged a signal with Rachel through a sympathetic cook who'd smuggled a message to her. When her song shifted to a particular hymn, she would be ready to move. The camp's dynamics had grown increasingly tense over the past week. Henry had gathered intelligence from passing traders about arguments between Moore and Walker, their alliance straining under the weight of greed. Walker wanted the map for himself, while Moore insisted on military control of any discoveries. Their distrust would work to Henry's advantage. As darkness settled over the valley, Henry positioned himself behind the supply wagons. He'd noticed how the evening meal always drew most of the soldiers to the mess tent, their discipline relaxing as they gathered to escape the day's heat. Tonight, he'd added an extra incentive. His deputy had arranged for a traveling merchant to accidentally leave behind several bottles of fine whiskey. The plan hinged on perfect timing and the human nature Henry had observed during his surveillance. He'd seen how the soldiers grew careless after sunset, how Walker's men clustered near their employer's tent, and how Lieutenant Moore insisted on personally interrogating Rachel each evening. These patterns had become predictable, like the movements of game animals before a hunter. A commotion erupted from the mess tent, right on schedule. The whiskey had been discovered, and the resulting celebration quickly drew more soldiers away from their posts. Henry watched as Walker stormed toward Moore's tent, right past Rachel's location, their raised voices carrying through the cooling air. The pieces were falling into place with a precision that almost made Henry nervous. Lieutenant Moore's face had grown red with fury as he squared off against Walker, their argument about claim rights and military authority echoing across the camp. "This territory belongs to whoever finds the city first," Walker shouted, his hand hovering near his pistol. Moore's response was lost in the growing chaos as several soldiers rushed to separate the men. Rachel's song changed to the agreed-upon hymn, barely audible above the commotion. Henry moved swiftly, using the distraction to approach her tent from behind. His knife made quick work of the canvas, and he found her waiting, her dark eyes calm despite the circumstances. She held a small leather pouch close to her chest, the map that had caused all this trouble. Their escape through the cut tent was covered by the brawl that had erupted between Walker's men and the soldiers. Henry led Rachel through the shadows toward the horses he'd hidden in a nearby arroyo. They mounted quickly, but just as they prepared to ride, a shot rang out. Lieutenant Moore had spotted them, his voice rising above the chaos as he ordered his men to pursue. Racing across the darkening desert, Henry and Rachel wove between rock formations and dry arroyos. The priestess proved to be an excellent rider, matching Henry's pace without hesitation. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit grew fainter as their horses' superior stamina and Henry's knowledge of the terrain gave them an increasing advantage. As they put distance between themselves and their pursuers, Rachel spoke for the first time, her voice carrying the weight of ancient wisdom. "The map is only part of the secret," she said, pulling the leather pouch from her clothing. "The true path to the city requires knowledge passed down through generations of my people. Moore and Walker would have never found it without understanding our ways." The night deepened around them as they rode toward El Paso, but Henry knew their journey was far from over. Moore and Walker would not give up easily, and the promise of unimaginable wealth would draw others into the pursuit. The map in Rachel's possession was about to change everything, not just for them, but for the entire territory. The real challenge was only beginning. The desert wind whipped sand across their faces as Henry guided them into a narrow canyon, the towering red walls providing temporary shelter from both the elements and any distant observers. Rachel dismounted with surprising grace, her ceremonial robes now covered in trail dust. As she spread the ancient map across a flat boulder, Henry noticed intricate symbols along its edges that seemed to shift in the dying light. Markings unlike any he'd seen on standard survey maps. "These patterns," Rachel explained, her finger tracing elaborate spirals. "They're not just decorations. They're a sacred calendar, showing when certain passages open and close with the seasons. The Spanish conquistadors never understood this. They thought brute force could reveal our city's secrets." Her dark eyes met Henry's with an intensity that made him understand why her people had chosen her as their last keeper of knowledge. The sound of distant hoofbeats echoing through the canyon walls made them both freeze. Henry drew his revolver instinctively, positioning himself between Rachel and the canyon's entrance. But instead of Moore's men, a lone rider emerged. Frank, Henry's deputy from El Paso, looking like he'd ridden through hell to find them. His horse was lathered with sweat, sides heaving from the hard ride. "Moore's telegraphed every marshal from here to Cheyenne," Frank reported between gulps of water from his canteen. "He's claiming you kidnapped a government witness, Henry. There's a reward posted, enough to turn honest men dishonest." The deputy's weathered face showed the strain of delivering news that transformed their flight into something far more complicated. Rachel's expression hardened as she carefully refolded the map. "Moore's lies spread like poison. The same way his men massacred my people when we refused to reveal the city's location. They burned our temple, murdered our elders." She paused, composing herself. "But they didn't understand that the knowledge, the true key to finding the city, lives in more than just this map." Henry weighed their options, knowing that heading straight to El Paso was now impossible. The territory between them and the border was too exposed, too easily watched. They needed a plan that would give them time to decipher the map's secrets while staying ahead of both Moore's men and opportunistic bounty hunters. The answer lay in the vast maze of canyons and hidden valleys that stretched toward Deadwood. "Frank," Henry said, his voice carrying the authority that had made him sheriff, "ride back through El Paso. Spread word that you spotted us heading toward Dodge City. That should buy us some time." He turned to Rachel, seeing the approval in her eyes. "We'll take the old Apache trails north. There's a place in the high country where we can hole up. Study that map properly." The deputy nodded, understanding the risk he was taking by helping them. "Moore's got friends in high places, Henry. Whatever's in that lost city must be worth more than just gold for him to pull strings like this." Frank's words hung heavy in the cooling evening air, confirming Henry's suspicions that they were dealing with forces far beyond simple greed. As they prepared to part ways, Rachel pulled a small object from her robes, a polished stone pendant on a leather cord. She pressed it into Frank's hand, speaking softly. "If you need to find us, this will guide you to the safe paths. It's been blessed by my ancestors to protect those who carry truth in their hearts." The deputy tucked the pendant carefully into his shirt, nodding his respect. The canyon grew darker as the sun slipped behind the western rim. Henry helped Rachel back onto her horse, noting how she whispered something in the animal's ear that seemed to calm its nervous stamping. They would need to ride through the night, using the darkness as cover while Frank's false trail drew their pursuers north. The real journey, the one that would test not just their survival skills but their understanding of ancient mysteries, was about to begin. Thunder rolled in the distance as they rode deeper into the maze of canyons, the first drops of rain carrying the scent of sage and mineral-rich earth. Rachel began singing softly in her native tongue, a melody that seemed to weave itself into the natural sounds around them. Henry felt the hair on the back of his neck rise, sensing that they had crossed some invisible boundary between the world he knew and one governed by forces he was only beginning to comprehend. The scorching sun beat down on Sheriff Henry Anderson as he crouched behind a weathered boulder, his keen eyes fixed on the abandoned mission below. The ancient stone building sat like a lonely sentinel in the disputed territory between El Paso and Mexican lands, its crumbling walls holding secrets that had sparked a war. Beside him, the priestess Margaret Clark clutched an ornate leather map case to her chest, her dark eyes wide with fear as military horses stomped restlessly in the courtyard below. Through his brass spyglass, Henry could make out Captain Frank Moore directing his men to search every corner of the mission grounds. The rogue cavalry unit had gone against direct orders from Fort Bliss, determined to claim the legendary treasure map for themselves. The irony wasn't lost on Henry. He'd spent years upholding the law, and now here he was, harboring a fugitive priestess and defying the U.S. Army. Margaret touched his arm gently, her voice barely above a whisper. "Sheriff, there's something you should know about the map. It's not just a path to gold, it leads to my people's most sacred site. The soldiers, they don't understand what they're dealing with." Her words carried the weight of generations, and Henry felt the burden of responsibility settling deeper onto his shoulders. The sound of boots on stone drew their attention as two soldiers ascended the hill behind their position. Henry pulled Margaret deeper into the shadow of the rocks, his heart pounding as he calculated their dwindling options. The priestess had trusted him with her secret when she'd stumbled into his office in El Paso 3 days ago, and he'd sworn to protect both her and the ancient knowledge she guarded. The situation had grown more complex with each passing hour. Daniel Walker, Henry's deputy, was waiting with horses in a hidden canyon 2 miles north, while Robert Taylor, a local rancher who owed Henry his life, had positioned his men to create a diversion when needed. The pieces were in place, but timing would be everything. One wrong move and they'd be caught between Moore's forces and the Mexican military patrols that regularly swept the area. Margaret's hand trembled as she opened the map case, revealing not just a map but an intricately woven tapestry of symbols and celestial markings. The Lost City isn't just about gold, Sheriff. It's a gateway, a place where the old world and the new once met in harmony. If Moore and his men desecrate it... She left the thought unfinished, but Henry understood. Some treasures were worth more than gold. A shout from below shattered the tension. Charlie Anderson, Henry's younger brother who'd infiltrated Moore's unit, had created the diversion they needed. Flames erupted from the mission's stable and soldiers scrambled to control the panicked horses. Henry grabbed Margaret's hand and they began their desperate dash toward the canyon, staying low among the rocks as bullets whizzed overhead. The chase that ensued was like nothing from Henry's 20 years of law enforcement. Moore's men pursued them through treacherous ravines while Mexican patrols, drawn by the commotion, approached from the south. Margaret proved surprisingly agile, following Henry's lead as they navigated the harsh terrain. Her determination matched his own. This wasn't just about escape anymore, but about preserving something precious and irreplaceable. Robert Taylor's men appeared on the ridgeline, drawing Moore's fire and buying them precious minutes. Henry's lungs burned as they finally reached the canyon, where Daniel waited with the horses. But their relief was short-lived. A bullet caught Daniel in the shoulder just as they arrived, and Henry had to make a split-second decision that would change everything. With practiced efficiency, Henry helped Margaret mount before tending to Daniel. The deputy's wound wasn't fatal, but he couldn't ride hard. "Go east," Daniel gasped through clenched teeth. "I'll lead them west with the extra horse. Meet at the old Taylor ranch." Henry hesitated, but his deputy's stern nod convinced him. They had to split up. It was their only chance. As they rode hard toward the rising moon, Margaret shared more about the Lost City. It wasn't just gold that Moore sought. There were artifacts of immense power, things the modern world wasn't ready to understand. Henry listened, realizing that every assumption he'd made about this mission had been wrong. The priestess wasn't just the last of her order. She was the keeper of knowledge that could reshape their understanding of the American frontier. The night deepened around them as they pushed their horses to the limit. Behind them, gunfire echoed off canyon walls as Robert's men engaged Moore's forces. Henry's mind raced through possibilities. They needed to reach Cheyenne, where Rachel Walker, Daniel's sister, could help them disappear into the Northern Territories. But first, they had to survive the night and ensure the map stayed out of Moore's hands. Thunder rolled across the sky as storm clouds gathered, and Henry felt the first drops of rain on his face. The weather would cover their tracks, but it also meant treacherous riding conditions. Margaret rode close beside him, her face set with determination. She was no longer the frightened woman who'd sought his help. She had become a warrior in her own right, ready to defend her sacred trust with her life if necessary. The storm intensified as Henry and Margaret reached a narrow pass between towering cliffs. Lightning illuminated the sheer rock faces, revealing ancient petroglyphs that seemed to watch their desperate flight. Margaret pointed to symbols that matched those on her map, confirming they were on the right path despite the treacherous conditions. The rain had turned the ground into a dangerous mix of mud and loose shale, forcing them to slow their pace. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit grew fainter, but Henry knew Moore's men wouldn't give up easily. The colonel had invested too much in finding the lost city, sacrificing his honor and the lives of his men in an obsessive quest for gold. The thunder masked the sound of hoofbeats, making it impossible to know how close their pursuers might be. Henry's hand stayed close to his revolver, ready for whatever emerged from the darkness. Margaret suddenly pulled her horse to a stop, gesturing urgently toward a nearly invisible crevice in the cliff face. They dismounted, leading their exhausted horses into the narrow passage. The space widened into a small cave where ancient handprints decorated the walls. Margaret touched them reverently, whispering prayers in her people's language. Henry watched her, understanding now why her knowledge was so valuable. These weren't just directions to treasure, but a connection to a lost civilization. As they waited out the worst of the storm, Margaret shared more about her order's mission. They weren't just guardians of gold, but keepers of knowledge that could prove the existence of advanced civilizations in the Americas long before European arrival. The lost city contained libraries of astronomical observations, mathematical discoveries, and historical records that would change everything. Henry realized the magnitude of what they were protecting went far beyond mere wealth. The storm began to subside, but their respite was shattered by the echo of voices. Moore's men had found the pass. Henry and Margaret retreated deeper into the cave system, discovering that the ancient handprints led to a hidden tunnel. They were forced to leave their horses behind, taking only essential supplies as they ventured into the darkness. The tunnel showed signs of deliberate construction, with smooth walls and occasional steps carved into the rock. As they progressed, Margaret translated more of the symbols, revealing that this passage was part of an extensive network connecting sacred sites across the territory. The air grew cooler, and the sound of running water reached them. The tunnel opened into a vast underground chamber where a subterranean river flowed. Ancient bridges spanned the water, their engineering defying the passage of time. Henry's experience told him they were heading northeast, toward Cheyenne, but through paths unknown to any map but Margaret's. The priestess explained that her people had used these routes for centuries, avoiding the conflicts that raged on the surface. They crossed one of the bridges, its stone surface worn smooth by countless feet before them. The chamber's acoustics carried the distant sounds of their pursuers, spurring them to move faster. The next passage sloped upward, leading them through increasingly narrow confines. Margaret's breathing became labored, and Henry noticed blood seeping through her sleeve. She'd been grazed by a bullet during their earlier escape, but had said nothing. He insisted on stopping to treat the wound, using strips torn from his shirt as bandages. As he worked, she shared more of her story, speaking of her training since childhood and the weight of being the last to carry her people's legacy. Their moment of rest was interrupted by a distant explosion. Moore's men were using dynamite to clear blocked passages. The vibrations loosened rocks around them, and they ran forward as the tunnel began to collapse behind them. The path ahead forked, and Margaret consulted the map by lantern light, her hands trembling with exhaustion. The right choice would lead them to safety. The wrong one could trap them underground forever. Just then, they heard a familiar voice calling their names. Rachel Walker had found them, having traced their likely route from intelligence gathered by Robert's men. She led them through the correct passage to a hidden exit near a waterfall, where horses waited. As they emerged into the pre-dawn light, Henry saw determination replace exhaustion in Margaret's eyes. They were still 2 days from Cheyenne, but now they had a chance, not just to survive, but to protect a legacy that could change the world's understanding of American history forever. Sheriff Henry Anderson and the priestess Rachel Moore rode hard through the night, the stolen map to the Golden City clutched tightly in Rachel's hands as they made their way toward the border territories near El Paso. Behind them, the thundering hooves of Captain Frank Taylor's cavalry unit echoed through the canyons, a reminder that their pursuers hadn't given up the chase. The sheriff's trusted stallion carried them swiftly across the rugged terrain, while Rachel clung tightly to his waist, her ceremonial robes fluttering in the cool desert wind. The first rays of dawn painted the sky in brilliant hues of orange and purple when they finally reached the hidden valley Rachel had described. Ancient stone structures emerged from the morning mist, their weathered surfaces covered in mysterious glyphs that seemed to pulse with an otherworldly energy. Henry helped Rachel dismount, his weathered hands gentle despite the urgency of their situation. "This is where your people kept the sacred texts?" he asked softly, studying the remarkable architecture before them. Rachel traced her fingers along the stone walls as they entered the main chamber, her eyes distant with memories. "For generations, my sisters and I protected these secrets," she explained. "We knew the soldiers would come eventually, hunting for the map, but we never expected them to destroy our entire temple." Her voice cracked with emotion as she remembered the night of fire and violence that had claimed the lives of her fellow priestesses, leaving her as the sole survivor and guardian of their ancient knowledge. The chamber they entered was vast, its ceiling lost in shadows high above. Ornate pillars lined the walls, each carved with symbols that told the story of a civilization lost to time. Henry kept his revolver ready as they moved deeper into the temple, knowing Captain Taylor and his men weren't far behind. The map had brought them here, but Rachel insisted there was something more valuable than gold hidden within these walls, something that could change the fate of the entire territory. Behind them, the sound of horses and men's voices echoed through the valley. "They're here," Henry muttered, positioning himself near the entrance while Rachel hurried to unlock an ancient mechanism hidden behind one of the pillars. The stone ground beneath their feet began to tremble as a hidden doorway slowly opened, revealing a passage that descended into darkness. "Whatever's down there better be worth all this trouble," the sheriff said, though his tone carried no reproach. The first shots rang out just as they began their descent into the underground chamber. Captain Taylor's voice boomed through the temple, demanding their surrender. But Henry and Rachel pressed on, using only the light of a small lantern to guide their way. The passage was narrow, forcing them to move single file through twisting corridors lined with more of the strange glyphs that seemed to whisper ancient secrets in the flickering shadows. What they found in the heart of the temple complex left even the hardened sheriff speechless. A vast chamber opened before them, its walls lined with crystalline formations that caught their lantern light and multiplied it 1,000-fold. But it wasn't gold that filled the room. It was knowledge. Thousands of scrolls and tablets filled shelves carved into the living rock, each containing wisdom and discoveries from a civilization far more advanced than their own. "This is what we protected," Rachel explained, her voice filled with reverence. "The Gold City was just a story to mislead those who would destroy everything to possess material wealth. These records contain knowledge that could transform the territory. New methods of farming in harsh conditions, engineering feats that could bring water to the desert, medical treatments unknown to modern doctors. This is the true treasure." The confrontation with Captain Taylor and his men came to a head in that crystal chamber, but when faced with the magnitude of what they'd discovered, even the hardened soldier found his greed for gold transformed into something greater. The knowledge contained in those ancient texts promised something far more valuable than mere riches. It offered hope for the future of the struggling territory and its people. In the days that followed, Rachel began the monumental task of translating the ancient texts, while Henry worked to establish a new kind of settlement around the temple, one where knowledge and wisdom would be valued above gold and silver. Other survivors from Rachel's order gradually emerged from hiding, drawn by news that their sacred site had been rediscovered. Captain Taylor, forever changed by what he'd witnessed, became one of their strongest allies in protecting the temple's secrets. The border territory near El Paso transformed over the following years, as the ancient knowledge was carefully shared with those who would use it wisely. Wells appeared in places where water had never been found before, crops flourished in soil that had once been barren, and new medicines saved lives that would have otherwise been lost. Henry and Rachel married in a ceremony that blended her ancient traditions with frontier customs, their union symbolizing the bridge between old wisdom and new frontiers. Looking back, Henry would often reflect that his decision to help Rachel had led to something far greater than any traditional search for gold. The true treasure hadn't been buried riches or lost cities. It had been the wisdom to build a better future for the territory and its people. The last priestess and the frontier sheriff had found something more precious than gold. They'd discovered a way to transform the harsh realities of the West into something closer to the paradise it had always promised to be. The peaceful transformation of El Paso rippled outward across the territory, though not without resistance. Some of the old guard, led by former soldiers who'd once hunted Rachel, gathered in Deadwood to plot against what they saw as dangerous mysticism. Henry received word through his network of deputies that a group planned to raid El Paso, hoping to steal the ancient texts Rachel had preserved and destroy what they couldn't understand. Rachel, now carrying their first child, urged Henry to approach the situation with wisdom rather than force. Together, they devised a plan that would echo the diplomatic traditions of her ancestors. Henry rode to Deadwood not with a posse of armed men, but with wagons loaded with proof of their success. Abundant crops grown in previously barren soil, medicines that had saved children from fever, and clean water drawn from impossibly deep wells. In Deadwood's dusty main street, Henry faced down the opposition led by a bitter former cavalry officer named Daniel. Instead of drawing his gun, the sheriff laid out the evidence of El Paso's transformation. The crowd that gathered included farmers whose lands were failing, mothers who'd lost children to disease, and ranchers watching their cattle die of thirst. The proof before them was more powerful than any weapon. Martha, a prominent widow whose drought-stricken ranch was failing, stepped forward first. She'd ridden 3 days from Cheyenne after hearing rumors of El Paso's miraculous changes. Her public declaration of support for Henry and Rachel's work turned the tide of opinion. Even Daniel couldn't deny the obvious benefits when Martha offered to host the first demonstration of the ancient irrigation techniques on her own land. The network of cooperation spread like wildfire across the territory. Rachel trained a new generation of students, carefully selecting those whose hearts were pure and whose minds were open to both old wisdom and new ideas. Among them was Laura, a young woman from Dodge City who showed particular promise in understanding the delicate balance between progress and preservation. Years passed, and the harsh borderlands gradually transformed. The lost city of gold was never found, but something more valuable emerged, a chain of communities working together, sharing resources and knowledge. The map Rachel had carried led not to material riches, but to a deeper understanding of the land itself. Henry's badge came to symbolize not just law and order, but the protection of this new way of life. As their child grew, Henry and Rachel established a school in El Paso where both practical frontier skills and ancient wisdom were taught. Students came from as far as Cheyenne and Dodge City, eager to learn. The former soldiers who had once hunted Rachel became some of their strongest allies, with Daniel himself eventually serving as head of security for the school, protecting the very knowledge he had once sought to destroy. The territory's transformation brought new challenges. Speculators and opportunists arrived, hoping to exploit the prosperity. But the network of communities, bound together by shared knowledge and mutual support, proved resilient. Susan, a former saloon owner from Deadwood, became an unexpected champion of their cause, using her business acumen to help establish fair trade practices that benefited all. Rachel's greatest fear, that her people's knowledge would die with her, gave way to hope as she watched her students master the ancient ways while adapting them to modern needs. The marriage of old and new created something entirely unique to the American West. Henry's initial quest for justice had evolved into a legacy that would endure long after both of them were gone. In the end, the story of the sheriff and the last priestess became legend throughout the territory, but not in the way of typical frontier tales. It was whispered around campfires not as a story of gunfights and gold, but as a reminder that the true wealth of the West lay in the wisdom to nurture the land and its people. The paradise they had helped create wasn't just a place. It was a way of life that would be passed down through generations, as enduring as the ancient knowledge that had made it possible.